I would like to not degenerate, as rapidly as some people do. So I'd like to stave off that degeneration and sort of extend the youthful part of my life. If there's anything I can do, anything I can do to make sure that people my age now realize this, they don't have to experience the misery, so they don't have to get on drugs, so they don't have to be miserable. I'm going to do it.
Mitochondria. You might not know what they are, but they are vital to your health. Hi, this is Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And today I am joined by Dr. Rhonda Patrick, a biomedical scientist. She has a PhD in that and has a very interesting history and is absolutely passionate about learning, applying what she's learning in science and how it can optimize our health. So welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Mercola. It's a pleasure to be here. Really excited.
Okay. Most people probably haven't heard of you before, so maybe if you can describe your specific training and some of your passions and how you've acquired your expertise.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I am a scientist. I did get a PhD in, technically, on my diploma it says biomedical science, but I did all of my graduate training at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, where I studied the interaction between metabolism and aberrant metabolism and cancer. So I've done a lot of research on cancer. Previously, before I actually started graduate school, I was a chemistry major in undergraduate. So in college, I did a lot of research on organic chemistry, and I sort of got, chemistry is fascinating, but I felt like it was a little too far removed from biology and from my quest and my curiosity for understanding the human body. So I decided to, after I got my degree in chemistry at the University of California, San Diego, I decided to try working in the biological sciences, kind of, get my feet wet to see if I enjoyed it. So I did some research at the Salk Institute for Biological Sciences in La Jolla, California, where I researched aging. And I used a little nematode roundworm called a C. elegans as a research model for aging because they have a lifespan of around 2 weeks. So it's very easy to manipulate an organism that lives only 2 weeks because, it's not a very long time. If you're going to do aging studies on humans, good luck. You're talking an average of, 80 years. So that, I've had, a variety of experiences doing research on aging, cancer, metabolism, and now currently I'm in Oakland, California, where I am a postdoc working with Dr. Bruce Ames, who is a professor. Yes, anyone that...
Ames of the Ames test.
Exactly, yes. He's had quite a profound effect.
That's been around a long time.
Long time, yeah. He's a professor emeritus from University of California, Berkeley, but he's still got a lab going in Oakland at Children's Hospital Oakland Research Institute, where the primary focus of the research there is the role of nutrition in preventing age-related diseases like cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, different, inflammatory-related diseases, obesity, type 2 diabetes. And so I've been doing a lot of research currently on nutrition and specifically what role micronutrients, which are essential vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, amino acids that are very important to run your metabolism. So I've been looking at the role of micronutrients in a variety of different important biological processes and how inadequacies in certain micronutrients can lead to insidious types of damage that can accumulate over decades and eventually in the 5th, 6th decade of life lead to things like cancer and Alzheimer's disease. So I'm looking sort of like at early biomarkers of those diseases. For example, cancer, an early biomarker of cancer is damage to DNA. And so I look at damage to DNA in people, and with the hope of then trying to figure out if we give these people the right micronutrients, for example, magnesium. Magnesium is a very important mineral that's needed for a lot of enzymes in the body to repair damage to DNA. So if you don't have enough magnesium around, then you may accumulate more of this damage, which you won't notice right now. You can't get up in the morning, look in the mirror and see DNA damage, but it's there, and it's happening, and it's accumulating, and it's insidious. So, 10, 20, 30 years from now, the end result of that damage is potentially, cancer-causing mutation, which then can lead to a cancer cell, which then can grow and proliferate and eventually form a tumor. You get the point. So,
sure.
So that's my
so.
current research.
It seems like some of your research is really dedicated on personally centered on your desire to optimize your own health and curiosity, and you have the flexibility to do that, and the skill set in the mind to incorporate that. So would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, it is, absolutely. I am obsessed with learning, much like I just can't quiet my brain. I have this hunger to learn more, and there's definitely a selfish component to it. I want to learn how to optimize my own cognitive performance, my athletic performance, and I want to also increase the youthful part of my life. So I want to be 90. I want to be out there surfing in San Diego, just like I was when I was 20. So I would like to not degenerate, as rapidly as some people do. So I'd like to stave off that degeneration and sort of extend the youthful part of my life as long as I possibly can, so I can enjoy this place.
I sensed that when I was watching some of your other podcasts, and I resonated with that immediately, because that's actually what drives me. So it's like we resonate on the same frequency from that perspective, which is why I'm excited to connect with you. So one of the areas of your earlier research was on mitochondrial function and metabolism, and that's actually been one of my recent passions too. I emailed you earlier a book I'd read, Dr. Lee No, on the life and metabolism of the mitochondria, which is a good primer for those who haven't read them in some other papers. But it just seems this is really, to understand the mitochondria and the influence of it has such enormous potential to influence our health, and specifically cancer. I think it may be the core of effective cancer treatment is to optimizing mitochondrial metabolism.
Well, you nailed it, Dr. Mercola. Mitochondria are the major source of energy in every single cell and every single organ in our body, whether we're talking about our brain, our heart, our liver, our kidneys. The function of these organs, in order for these organs to do their function, it requires energy, and that energy is made from mitochondria. So, mitochondrial function is at the heart, the very heart of everything in the body. So, yes, understanding mitochondrial function, optimizing mitochondrial function, and making sure to prevent mitochondrial dysfunction, making sure you get all the right components, all the right precursors you need for your mitochondria to work optimally, and making sure that you're not doing something to cause more damage to the mitochondria is extremely important for cancer, for neurodegeneration, for, everything, for gut health, just brain function, it's endless. So,
well, let's just take a step back, because there are a fair number of people here who don't have biomedical training, and they may have heard mitochondria but have no clue to what it is. So we'll just give a little definition. And these are little tiny organelles that originally are thought to be derived from bacteria, and every cell has from about 100 to 100,000 of them. That's a lot of mitochondria inside every one of your cells, 10 trillion cells. So as you mentioned, they generate the power and the energy. But an interesting observation that I wasn't aware of until recently, there's been this dramatic focus on the molecular biology of cancer and this tremendous emphasis on trying to identify the genetics of it and to manipulate that in some way, to find some markers, and there's just enormous amounts of research, as you know, that go into that. But they're not looking at morphologically what's happening to the cells. And if you do, it seems to be one of the universal characteristics of cancer cells is they have radically decreased numbers of mitochondria and functional mitochondria. So that maybe is a clue that if you're disrupting the mitochondria, that addressing the mechanisms that do that may go a long way towards helping really not only prevent but treat cancer.
Yes, I did a lot of work on mitochondrial metabolism, specifically in cancer cells, and the thing is that it's so incredibly complicated, and trying to figure it out it's a lifelong project. So it's nice that a lot of different scientists and brain power are working towards that. But the mitochondria, they can still function in cancer cells. So it's weird. I don't quite understand why cancer cells. One of the things that occurs is they immediately become dependent on glucose and not using their mitochondria, even though they have mitochondria there, which can function, but they make this metabolic switch. And I have a sort of a theory as to why that may be, if you want me to sort of elaborate that on.
Sure. Yeah, and let me just interject here that this is not new information, that Warburg actually, who as a biochemistry you can fully appreciate, was probably, he was a German physician and PhD, but generally recognized as the greatest biochemist of the 20th century. Got a Nobel Prize for it. And he also got 3 other Nobel nominations. He was a brilliant man, and he figured out that cancer cells actually use glucose metabolized or fermented anaerobically as their source of energy production, which is relatively inefficient. But they don't use oxygen. They ferment glucose. So yes, let's hear your theory.
Right. Yeah. So I agree with you. Otto Warburg was brilliant, and he was the first to make that discovery. Like you said, he won the Nobel Prize for it. What was really interesting about that is that when he first made this observation that cancer cells do make this switch in the way they use energy and produce energy by not using oxygen, by not using their mitochondria, originally he thought it was because their mitochondria were all non-functional. But then he published a paper after that, stating he was wrong. The mitochondria are functional. They're just not being used. And so it's very confusing, and we still haven't figured it out. We haven't figured it out. Okay.
Well, there's not a lot of people looking at it. That's the issue. The emphasis isn't on that. They're really focusing on the molecular biology.
It's growing now. It's definitely I, as a graduate student, was working on the metabolic underpinnings in cancer cells, and there's a whole group of people out there. Craig Thompson, for one, he's doing some really pioneering work. Ralph DiBardinis, he's also doing some great work on cancer metabolism. Lou Cantley, these are all scientists that are really pioneering some new research on mitochondria in cancer and the metabolism of cancer. But I do, just to circle back to my little pet theory. One thing about cancer cells is that they are damaged. I mean, they have acquired a lot of damage, and there's a lot of genetic changes that have occurred both in the mitochondrial genome and in the nuclear DNA of these cancer cells. And the body has a protective mechanism. Like, it can sense when there is damage. When there is damage to a cell, a genetic pathway gets activated because the cell knows, hey, wait, this isn't good. This may potentially lead to cancer. I'm going to go ahead and try to kill myself. I'm going to undergo cell death as a protective mechanism to, not get cancer. But cancer cells have found a way around that, and they're like, well, hey, you're going to try to kill me. I'm going to increase all these other genes that are involved in preventing death. So it's kind of like this balance between pro-death and anti-death. and they're both raised. So really, cancer cells have this whole crazy genome going on where they have a lot of these, pro-death signals going on. But at the same time, they have all these anti-death signals going on to counter it. And the mitochondria, when you are producing energy from the mitochondria, so the oxygen that we breathe in is coupled to the food we eat. There's a reason why we need oxygen, and there's a reason why we need food. And that's because those two processes, I know you know this, Dr. Mercola, are coupled together in a process, just for learning, it's called oxidative phosphorylation. And that's really what the mitochondria are doing. They're taking the oxygen you breathe in, they're taking the food you eat, and they're doing all this cool stuff together and producing energy in the form of ATP, which is what essentially runs, like I said, every function in your body, from your brain function to your heart beating to your liver, everything. However, that process produces byproducts that are very damaging to the cell, very damaging to mitochondrial DNA, damaging to mitochondria, damaging to all your DNA, to your cell, to the proteins inside your cell, which are doing all the function of everything.
Cellular membranes.
Exactly, cellular membranes. So because mitochondrial metabolism inherently, the energy you produce from it, there's a trade-off because you're also making damage at the same time. And this is part of normal metabolism, normal aging.
And probably beneficial. And if you didn't produce those free radicals, those reactive oxygen species, you'd be sick because you need those. They're normal signals that your body requires.
Yes, exactly. They are normal signals. But to a cancer cell, that reactive oxygen species is a signal, like you said, they're signals. It's a signal for many things, for increasing good genes, antioxidant genes that are involved in combating that. But it's also a signal for death. So it activates these pro-death genes. And because, as I mentioned, the cancer cells are already, they have all the pro-death and they've made all the anti-death, a little bit more pro-death tips them towards death. In fact, that's the mechanism by which chemotherapeutic drugs work. So the reason why chemotherapeutic drugs predominantly can kill cancer cells, they kill many different good cells, and that's a whole other can of worms to get into. But one of the mechanisms by which these chemotherapeutic drugs works is because they create reactive oxygen species, they create damage, and that's enough to push that cancer cell into death. So I'm wondering if the cancer cell doesn't want, by the way, you can actually reactivate mitochondria through a variety of pharmacological drugs, and I've done this experimentally in the lab several times, and kill a cancer cell. And I think the reason for that is because all of a sudden, a cancer cell, which is not using its mitochondria, meaning it's not producing those reactive oxygen species any longer, all of a sudden you force it to use its mitochondria, and you get a burst of reactive oxygen species because that's what mitochondria do. And boom, death, because that cancer cell's already primed for that death. It already is ready to die. So anyways, that was sort of
well, no, that's a really interesting discussion. And, I've been a fan of intermittent fasting for quite some time for a variety of reasons, certainly longevity and health issues, but also it appears it has a really potent implication on the treatment of cancer. And it appears the mechanism is through this mitochondria because especially, I had initially thought intermittent fasting, it didn't really matter on the timing and that skipping breakfast was probably the easiest way to do it. But it seems that skipping dinner might be better because from a perspective of these the process you described earlier where there's this surplus, there's this normal side effect of energy production is the production of reactive oxygen species and secondary free radicals. But that's that's directly related to the amount of fuel that one is consuming. So if you're consuming a lot of fuel at a time when your body has no or virtually no need for fuel, it's just you exceed the capacity to compensate for these the normal metabolites. So you create an excess of reactive oxygen species. So the classic example would be eating before you go to bed, when your body is metabolically relatively quiet and has the least amount of need for fuel, and you're giving this extra fuel, and it's just like trying to, I guess, rev your engine with a car with a gas motor with the brakes on. It's like not a good idea. You're going to cause some damage and destruction. So it seems a really simple, easy, effective strategy would be to implement something where you just don't eat a lot of food before you go to bed. And have a certain amount of time where you're essentially fasting.
Dr. Mercola, that's very interesting that you bring this up. I'm sort of thinking about it from a different perspective, but it's also in line with what you're saying. So the way I always think about it, why you shouldn't eat before bed, and it has to do with the mitochondria as well, is because your circadian rhythm, which is regulated by the day-night cycle, the sleep and not sleeping cycle at night. Your body is the least insulin sensitive that it can be. So eating a bunch of food later in the evening, your metabolism's all mucked up because all the genes that run metabolism are shutting down on the genetic level. So in the morning, they're turned on, they're active, your mitochondrial genes are, give me some fuel, they're revved up. But in the night, they're quiet. And so if you're eating a large meal right before you're going to bed, or, even, soon before you go to bed, there's a couple of things that, are problematic. One is that you're not very insulin sensitive. So, you talked in great detail about that. Two is, so you're probably going to end up you're going to store a lot of that energy as fat, so it's, it's very interesting that you had made that observation with the intermittent fasting and doing it,
Well, yeah, I've been a fan for a long time, and there are several researchers, you may be aware of some of them, Dr. Thomas Seyfried and Dominic D'Agostino, who are really early proponents of it, and you probably know others and can clue me in onto those researchers. But, they're using this clinically to treat cancers, and interestingly, Dr. D'Agostino is also integrating hyperbaric oxygen in addition to the intermittent fasting to take advantage of the fact that these cancer cells do not like oxygen. So you're like giving this double whammy, and you could actually even integrate smaller amounts of chemotherapy and make the chemo far more effective at a much lower dose with virtually no side effects, or far less side effects for sure. Yeah. So it's an interesting strategy.
Yeah, I think that part of, you mentioned, Dominic D'Agostino, and
yes.
I am familiar with some of his work. I'm definitely familiar with, is it Siegfried? I never know how to pronounce it.
No, Seyfried. Seyfried.
Thank you. I've definitely read a lot of his work when I was in graduate school, because that was what my whole thesis was about, mitochondrial metabolism and cancer. And I think that part of the mechanism by which fasting, and also even a ketogenic diet, true ketogenic diet, works is because when you're fasting, your body has to rely on lipids, on stored fat for energy, which means they have to use their mitochondria. Your mitochondria are is the only mechanism by which your body can make energy from fat. So again, it comes back to that activating the mitochondria. I think that really plays a huge part in the mechanism by which intermittent fasting kills cancer cells, by which activating the mitochondria with certain pharmacological drugs can kill cancer cells, is because now you're creating that burst of reactive oxygen species, which is, like I said, the cancer cells are just ready. They're primed to die. They're ready to die, but they just need that little push. They need that little push to death. So, and of course, there's a lot of very other interesting mechanisms that occur when you're fasting. Your body also clears away damaged cells through a process called autophagy, which basically means a cell that's damaged can die, but if it doesn't die, sometimes it becomes what's called senescent, and this happens a lot with aging. And what that means is that the cell is not dead, but it's not really alive. It's not, doing its function. It's just kind of sitting around in your body, and it's secreting pro-inflammatory molecules, things that are damaging other nearby cells, thereby accelerating the aging process, because inflammation, drives aging in so many different ways. So autophagy clears away those cells that are just sitting there creating damage and not doing much else, which is nice, because, that's also a very important biological mechanism for staying healthy.
Now, some people listening to this may be disinterested because they don't have cancer, or no one close to them has cancer. But let's to put this in perspective, the potential for cancer for all of us is very high. It's one of the leading causes of death, and the rate of exploding may even pass cardiovascular diseases in the not too distant future. And it's a miserable way to die prematurely. And most people with cancer tend to die earlier. So this is one that will take out younger people. More. I mean, elderly die from cancer too, of course, but it tends to hit a younger population than some of the other degenerative diseases. So maybe you can comment on that, for the reason why pretty much everyone listening to this should be interested.
Yeah, I mean, so cancer, like you said, much later in life, it's not. If you make it into your 8th decade of life, you're 80 years old, you're likely not going to get cancer. Mm-hmm. It's something that hits around 5th, 6th decade, and it can hit, earlier. It can hit sometimes in the 3rd and 4th decade. Mm-hmm. I mean, I had a very, very good friend of mine who passed away when he was 34. He died of a very specific type of cancer called mesothelioma, which,
sure.
Yeah, so,
and of course there's pediatric cancers, they're just not as common.
Right, yeah, pediatric cancers are mostly cancers of the blood system, so leukemias, lymphomas, but you can get some muscle types of cancers, or sarcomas, and also some brain cancers as well. And but adult cancers hit, mostly are solid tumors, so prostate cancer, ovarian, kidney, breast, exactly. A lot, any sort of tumor or carcinoma, lung cancer. Yeah. It's a terrible, terrible thing. If you have, you want to do everything you can in your control to prevent yourself from getting cancer. Because once you have cancer, those little guys are so smart and they are so bad, and they will take over, and it's awful.
Yeah. So this is what we're talking about are really simple strategies to, in most cases, essentially eliminate the risk of cancer, which is just profoundly phenomenal. I mean, it's the goal that Nixon started in the 60s, this war on cancer, which has been a miserable failure, of course. And, because it was too complex, it typically results in, you need a simpler strategy. And, just optimizing mitochondrial health by the steps that we were mentioning is really, seems to be a large part of the solution.
Yeah, it is. Making sure your mitochondria, your mitochondrial enzymes, majority of them require B vitamins as cofactors to function properly. And for people that don't know what that means, it means, if you think about your lock on your door, you have a key that fits right into that lock and will open it. But you can't take your key for your door and go to your neighbor's and open their door, because the key doesn't fit right. So the key is very important for the door to unlock or lock. So that's the function of the door, right? Well, cofactors are essential minerals and vitamins that fit right nicely into an enzyme, so that enzyme can do its function properly. And when you don't have that cofactor there to fit in it, the enzyme is not doing its function very well. And in the case of mitochondria, it will then lead to aberrant mitochondrial function. It'll make more of those reactive oxygen species, more than it should, which can lead to more damage. It can cause all sorts of problems. The other thing is making sure you're not giving it all the wrong stuff, right? So you want to get the right stuff, but you don't want to get, all these refined carbohydrates, refined sugars, things that are, that can also lead to damage that will damage the mitochondria. So it's sure. important to take, make sure both things are
Yeah, most of the people watching this will be aware of those strategies because we talk about it all the time on our site and have for the last 20 years almost. So, but what I'd like to focus on is one of your passions and recent interests in these micronutrients and how they apply to mitochondrial function, and from your perspective, what you might view as the sort of the top essential nutrients you would use or identify to optimize mitochondrial function.
Yeah, so I think some of the important micronutrients to optimize mitochondrial function are one, B vitamins. All of the B, I mean, riboflavin,
Really?
thiamine, B6, they're all cofactors. Yes, yes, they're very important for mitochondrial function. And something that's very interesting is that as we age, our cell membranes become stiffer. As you mentioned, some
Mm-hmm.
damage happens to cell membranes. That damage is a function.
Is that reversible? Say a person, you know, was a typical American diet, had saturated fats, trans fats, and just processed foods, and just a lot of pernicious toxins in their environment or their food supply, and they have an epiphany, and they just get the fear of God in them, or motivated and catalyzed to pursue the healthiest diet possible. From your perspective, how reversible is that damage?
It depends on the cell type. So, in some cases, it's very reversible because you're gonna get rid of that cell and you're gonna make a new cell, and so then you have you can start over, so to speak, right? But in some cases, you're talking about stem cells, cells that are around for a very long time. It's much more difficult to reverse that damage, but you can reverse it to some degree. So, by your cell membrane is composed of a variety of different phospholipids, lipids, and cholesterol. And so there's a balance between a lot of these components. And if you give yourself, for example, polyunsaturated fat like omega-3, DHA, specific docahexaenoic acid, which is one of the marine omega-3 fatty acids, is a large, large component in all cell membranes. And it is very important for the fluidity of that membrane. So there's a balance between cholesterol and DHA, and that's very important for the fluidity of the membrane. Now, why is that important? Well, that's important because nutrients get transported into the cell, B vitamins being some of those nutrients that I'm talking about. And it has been shown that as the membranes become more stiff with age, as you mentioned, Dr. Mercola, if you're eating trans fats, for example, trans fats, they're so horrible, but
Hey, there actually is something worse. Cyclic aldehydes, which is what's created when you use a substitute, because the FDA, basically due to Kumro's lawsuit. Kumro, of course, is the initial investigator for trans fats in the 30s or 50s, but they banned them. They will be banned, so they're replacing them with these other oils that create cyclic aldehydes when you heat them at high temperature, which are even worse. They're even worse than trans fats.
Wait, you're kidding me.
No, I am not. Nina, I can't remember her last name, Techholz, or she wrote a whole book on it. And I did an interview with her. It was just like, oh my gosh, it's like go from the frying pan into the fire.
Oh God, that's awful. Aldehydes. So, I mean, the cyclic aldehydes are going to absolutely damage the cell They're going to do this almost the same thing that trans fats do, but a different mechanism, totally different mechanism. And they're going to make, so, you basically, you get this carbonyl group eventually. That's what these damaging aldehydes do. And they cause the membrane to become stiff. They play a role in Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease. Wow, that's awful. That is so, like, I wish you hadn't told me that because
I just about fell in my chair when she told me this was happening. So, oh my gosh, so it's just like it took, 30, 40, 50 years to get trans fat out of the food supply. And now they throw something even worse in it. It's going to take us another few decades to first identify the dangers, document it, and then get it banned from the industrialization. I mean, ultimately it goes down to you just have to eat real food,
Yes,
It's a simple strategy to avoid all this nonsense, but in the meantime, most people aren't going to do that, so you have to seek these interventions to help protect the bulk of the population.
right. And the problem is when you eat out, you never know what they're giving you. Like, I'll give you an example. Here in Berkeley, I'll sometimes go to this coffee shop that I like to work from, and they serve salads there. right? Well, salad is supposed to be healthy,
Sure.
So, one day I said, you're using olive oil, right? This bowl is olive oil. He says, no, it's canola oil because olive oil is too expensive. And, it's just,
So it's GMO, of course,
of course,
sprayed
yeah,
with glyphosate or Roundup, which is even worse. And but this, they could also put vegetable oils in there,
right. Vegetable oil,
which is more common,
right. So,
corn oil, and
yeah, exactly.
which
So,
is also GMO.
there's all sorts of problems, but
Devil's in the details. But anyway, getting back to the mitochondrial nutrients, I was a bit surprised you said B vitamins. They're clearly a part of, but important. But I was thinking you might come up with ubiquinol or CoQ10 or magnesium
magnesium
is another cofactor. So maybe you can rate them from your perspective, as someone who's really studied this in the lab and really devoured the literature on this. You've got a relatively unique understanding of this, and I'm sure many people would like to hear your perspective.
I think that if I'm going to rate them from most important to least important in terms of taking, a supplement, for example, or getting it from your food, the reason I say B vitamins, number one, is because there are so many B vitamins that are cofactors for mitochondrial enzymes to work. So you need to make sure you're getting those B vitamins, all riboflavin.
Do you think you need a supplement, or can you get it from a high quality diet?
Well, high quality diet's always my favorite. I prefer to get as many micronutrients as I can from whole foods, for a variety of reasons. One, they're complex with fiber and things help with absorption. They're in the right ratio, so you're not getting too much of one, and so the balance is right. There's other components that are probably yet to be identified that are in there. However, in addition to being, you have to be very vigilant in making sure you're eating a very broad spectrum and getting the right micronutrients. There are a variety of polymorphisms in genes, which means basically polymorphism just means it's a variation in the sequence of DNA in the gene, which changes the gene function slightly. So, for example, there are very common polymorphisms. I have it, my husband, my mother-in-law. In fact, many people that I've looked at their DNA, they have polymorphisms that make them have lower levels of vitamin B12. Or they can't use folate a certain way. Folate has many functions, so they can't use it a certain way
which is also a B vitamin.
Exactly. So there's a lot of these polymorphisms, and I think the reason these polymorphisms are around, if we look hard enough, there's always a benefit. So for example, if you lived in a region where there was a high selenium in the soil, you may, throughout time, evolution, there may be a selection for not absorbing so much selenium because, too much selenium can be toxic. So as a consequence, you may have this whole, group of people that have polymorphisms in genes that make them not absorb selenium as well. Well, the same goes for many other micronutrients, and these are all very common polymorphisms. So I think that taking a B complex supplement is good for that reason. It's the reason I take one. And also for the reason of as we age, we also do not get B vitamins into our cells as readily, largely due to that part I was telling you about stiffer membranes, changes the way B vitamins get absorbed. Yeah, so there's no real B vitamins are water soluble, so they're not stored in fat. There's not really an upper toxicity associated with them. If anything, you're gonna, pee a little bit more out. But I really think that they're beneficial. So that's one. Two, magnesium. Okay. Magnesium is also very, very important for mitochondrial function. It's important to make new mitochondria. It's important to repair damage that's been done to your mitochondrial DNA. So magnesium is important to repair damage that's done to all DNA, whether we're talking about DNA in your mitochondria or DNA in your nucleus, which is, your genomic DNA. So it's important for that. It's important to actually, for all the enzymes that make ATP and utilize it. So, we're talking about a very essential function for every single process in the body. Magnesium is very important, and half the country doesn't get enough. So,
Hmm.
magnesium,
Maybe more.
yeah,
Maybe
maybe
more.
more. Magnesium is found at the center of a chlorophyll molecule, and chlorophyll is what gives plants their green color.
Sure.
Spinach, dark green leafy vegetables, they're high in magnesium, and
Hmm.
people just aren't eating enough of their greens.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I
so,
mean, that would solve a lot of problems. People ate more high quality, organic, locally grown, preferably vegetables, because they get not only the magnesium, but a variety of other nutrients, many of which probably haven't even yet been discovered.
right, right. Exactly. I think there's a lot of micronutrients that are present in plants, and we haven't figured them out yet. We don't know exactly
Sure.
what they are, what they're doing. Um,
So ideally, go back to eating real food,
it is. That's
high quality real food.
right, right.
That's the core. I mean, it's just after studying health for so many decades, it's a relatively simple conclusion, and it's not that complicated.
And once you start
But
doing it, you feel good, and you want to do it.
yeah,
You know, that's the thing.
that's true, and I'm sure you're reaching similar conclusions from the direction that you're pursuing it also. Getting back to the nutrients, how would you rate CoQ10 or ubiquinol, which is the reduced version of CoQ10?
Yes. So I think the reduced version of CoQ10 ubiquinol is a little better, but it's also more expensive. If I'm
Yes,
correct,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Those are both good. So this is something that we actually make inside of our cells, inside of our mitochondria, and it plays a very important role in mitochondrial metabolism. Um, I think that it becomes particularly relevant in people that do have mitochondrial disorders. Like it can play a huge role in helping them overcome some problems with energy, making energy. So I think that supplementation with ubiquinol, and if you take a larger dose of ubiquinone as well, is beneficial. It's
Mhm.
beneficial.
I
So
saw some really impressive videos from there's only one manufacturer of ubiquinol in the world. It's a Kanaka out of Japan. They hold a patent on it. So they did some internal studies on rats and gave them compared it to those who were ubiquinol supplement versus those who weren't, and it was just like mind-boggling to see it. Unfortunately, they won't release these videos on their research, but it was so impressive.
wow,
So ubiquinol supplemented one versus the ubiquinol one, the ones who weren't.
right. And another thing. Sorry to
Sure.
you off, but this your mentioning that reminds me of my mentors. Some of my mentors' previous research. He's done a lot of work on mitochondria, and him and a former postdoc of his, who's now running or in charge of a part of the Linus Pauling Institute in Corvallis, Oregon, found that acetylcarnitine and alpha lipoic acid both can reverse cognitive defects in old rats and are
Mm.
essentially mediated through a mitochondrial function because they're also cofactors for mitochondrial enzymes. So while I once in a while if I remember, I supplement with the alpha acid, but there is actually pretty substantial evidence that it is important for mitochondrial function, and I probably should focus more on that.
Well, and diabetes too, I think.
Yeah,
Although, yeah, but that's if you have diabetes because it's so darn easy to treat. It's one of the easiest and most common clinical conditions that's almost completely reversible. Of course, we're talking about type 2, not type 1. But and the sad reality is that almost all physicians don't understand this.
yeah, it's
They rely on oral hypoglycemics and send them to the traditional dietitian to get a I don't know, I forget, a high carbohydrate diet.
wow.
Yeah. So, all right, well, that's good. Any other strategies to optimize mitochondrial function?
Well, I think exercise is very
Mhm.
important. So when you exercise, you are forcing your mitochondria to work harder. And as we talked about previously, some of the byproducts of mitochondria working harder are they make reactive oxygen species. And as you mentioned, Dr. Mercola, these reactive oxygen species are signaling molecules in a way. And one of the functions they signal is to make more mitochondria. It's kind of like it's the body's way of going, oh my God, I'm using all these mitochondria. it's you're applying this work, you're working hard. So the body's like, well, what do? I need to make more of these mitochondria. So it's called mitochondrial biogenesis. And exercise is a fantastic way of increasing making more mitochondria in your cell. So
there's many different types of exercise. Which ones have found to be particularly useful? There's strength training, aerobics, high intensity.
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, I haven't dove into that literature so much to really give you. I really can't answer which one's better. I've seen that all of them do increase mitochondrial biogenesis, and maybe you've read some literature on that.
No, I don't.
Okay, well, that's something that I'm going to have to look into. It's a really good question.
Well, I think so whether or not it's mitochondria, but just general health, I think it's a combination of all of them. I'm not a big fan of cardio. I did cardio for almost 4 decades before I realized that there's probably better strategies to use exercise to improve your health. And strength training is a darn good one because there's many different ways you can do that. But high intensity too, so high intensity and strength training and some flexibility training in there, and this general mobility. And I don't know how that impacts mitochondrial biogenesis, but one of the realizations I've had recently is that there's a mobility requirement or a movement requirement which is independent of exercise, and they're related, but they really are separate. I'm convinced. So that you can, and I made the mistake for 4 decades or almost 50 years. I'd be really fit going out and exercising, thought I was reading my exercise requirements, and I'd go and sit down for 14 hours. You just can't do that. You've got to move around. So any thoughts on how just some simple activities, walking or moving or gardening, might have that impact mitochondrial biogenesis? Yeah,
I don't know about impacting mitochondrial biogenesis, but I do agree with you on moving, how important that is. And it's interesting because I've recently was traveling, and when you're somewhere new, you have this urge, like, if I don't get out and see it, I'm wasting my time and money, and I came to this place. And so I was walking around a lot, and I felt fantastic. I mean, I don't know exactly what and why, it's something that I'm going to look into, but, it was very obvious to me that moving more, because I very much am the same way, because I'm always diving into science, I'm sitting and I'm reading a lot, and I love doing that, but trade-off is I'm sitting. Well,
you're still relatively young, so the younger you are, the more damage you can tolerate before it starts to accumulate and really devastate your physiology and your anatomy.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's really interesting that you mentioned is mobility, and it's something that's very important as you age. So as you get older, one of the problems is older people become less mobile, and then they have the risk of, falling and taking a hip out, and that'll take you out when you're older. I mean, that's something that could really lead to mortality. So having this mobility and flexibility is extremely important, not just for all these molecular processes going on inside your body, but for just basically being more mobile, so that you don't end up falling and breaking a hip, and then becoming even more immobile. So.
And not limited or restricted as you age, and it certainly because I encountered that because of all this excessive sitting. I felt like I was 80 years old. I'd get up real slowly from a chair, and I'd be bent over, and I said, well, "This doesn't make any sense. I shouldn't be feeling this way." So, once you lose that function, and that you realize how important it is to maintain that as you age. I think it's really one of the key things is to be completely mobile, flexible, and have complete range of motion and pain-free.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's what you want to strive for, and you can do it. And if we look at these indigenous cultures that aren't corrupted by Western influences, you can see that they lead very simple lifestyles, and that's what they're doing. They're moving. They're spending a lot more time to secure their food, so that's a big part of it. But they have this continuous movement. They're not sitting down all day, and they frequently live into their 90s and 100s with very good function, very high function.
Exactly. Isn't that one of the common denominators between these cultures that do have a higher percentage of centenarians living to be 100 is that
I believe that is, yeah.
yeah, they're out gardening, they're walking to places, instead of getting in their car and driving to the store, they're out walking around and just moving a lot. I think that actually is one of the common denominators for longevity. At least that was identified by National Geographic.
Sure.
Forgot his name, but I think it's called like the Blue Zones.
Sure. Yes. Yes. He wrote that's a very famous book.
Yeah.
Um, it's sad that many people when they're younger don't appreciate this. I mean, certainly most teenagers don't, almost all teenagers, I would think, but because they feel that they're essentially, they're not going to be influenced by this, but inevitable. And that, I think, it's one of the things impressive me about you is that you adopted this approach early on, where you have a really significant chance of impacting your health and the health of your children, because I'm sure at some point you'll be raising some children, and that is one of the best things you can do, is to optimize your lifestyle so that when you do bear children, they're healthy. And many ancient cultures recognize this too. In fact, they would go through very rigorous strategies to have birth control so that they wouldn't have children close together. They would have several years for the woman to recover the micronutrients that she would need to deliver a healthy child, which is not something that's being typically done in Western cultures.
That's interesting. I definitely had not heard of that. But to get back to your pointing out my interest earlier in life, I think that I've taken a little bit of my obsessive compulsive, like I get a little obsessive with things, and I've tried to use it to my benefit, where I'm focusing on good things instead of bad things. So, but it's true. As you're young, you feel immortal. You feel like you're not going to age, and and that you're not going to be subject to all these degenerative things that you see in your grandparents or your neighbors or whatever. And the reality is that we're all aging, every single one of us. Mm-hmm. And it's just a matter of how well we do it. There was a study that was published very recently, a couple of months ago, that showed people, even though they're the same chronological age, they age biologically at very different rates. So the study cohort was around, I think it was around 100 or so people. Don't remember the exact number, but the interesting thing was that researchers followed these humans for three different, for a long time. There were three different time points in their life. They started when they were like 22, and then another time point when they were 32, and then another when they were 38. And at each time point, a variety of different biomarkers were taken, like 14 different biomarkers. Telomere length was looked at, DNA damage was looked at, cholesterol, LDL, glucose, metabolism, insulin sensitivity, on and on, so there's all these different biomarkers of health that were looked at. And what was found was that so if you looked at someone that was 38, they biologically could look 10 years younger based on their biological markers, or 10 years older. So, even though they were the same age, they aged biologically at very different rates. And in fact, if you took a photograph of these individuals that were, in this study, and you showed it to another bystander and asked them to guess their chronological age, what was interesting, and this is part of the publication, is that people would guess their biological age rather than their chronological age. So let's say the person looked real haggard and just looked a little worn out. Even though they were 38, their age would be guessed at, closer to 48. So versus if someone looked really young and youthful and healthy, their age would be guessed, even though they were 38, their age would be guessed closer to 28. So, and that would correspond with their biological biomarkers.
Yeah, I'm certain those differences would be even more extreme as you extended the age, because 38 is still relatively young. That's not even approaching middle age. So if you get someone in their 50s and 60s and compare to someone in their 20s, I mean, you could theoretically have someone in 60s as young and healthy looks younger and healthy than a 30-year-old who may look like you're 65.
I don't know about you, but I'm ready to adopt the biological age system, So, the point
Yes,
is
indeed.
really is for people to understand that, the way you age, while aging is inevitable, and we're all aging, the rate at which you age, you have some control over, and the way
Not
you
some enormous. I
right,
think
you do. You have
it's
more.
enormous control, which is really the empowering capacity. Because not only do you, I mean, it's definitely nice. I know anyone who would want to speed up the rate at which they age, but even if that's not a motivation, you're not going to get sick. You're not going to die prematurely. You're not going to have these degenerative diseases which will take you out and make you miserable, or have to take drugs for them. I mean, so that's the benefit. When you optimize these things, you get the anti-aging as a benefit. It's not really, even though it doesn't have to be your goal. If you it just is an artifact of that strategy.
Exactly. I mean, even if you're not going to extend your lifespan by 2 decades, like you said, the quality of your life is going to be exponentially better. I mean, who wants to be immobile and pain and decrepit, and you can't even, cook your own food and go to the grocery store? I mean, that's a miserable, I mean, I hate saying that because some people are out there experiencing that, but
some, there's tens of millions of people right now in the U.S. who are suffering from this. And that is really what motivates me, and it very clearly it motivates you also. That's one of the things that interested me in your perspective is that it doesn't have to be this way, that there are simple approaches that you can take, and that science can help us identify what some of these strategies are, and prove that there's just simple approaches that can mitigate against these events from happening.
To make you happier. I mean,
yes.
Doesn't everyone want to be happier? Yeah, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart when I see people that are disabled, elderly people that are disabled and just miserable. And, when you're disabled and you're in pain, that affects your brain function. It affects your mood, your behavior, and and it's so unfortunate because so much
doesn't
that
have to be.
Yeah, and if there's any,
doesn't have to be.
I mean, I know that my mission is in line with yours in that if there's anything I can do to make sure that people my age now realize this, they don't have to experience the misery, so they don't have to get on drugs, so they don't have to be miserable. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do all I can.
Well, so thank you so much for joining us today. But if people, you are a wealth of information, and not only you have your own podcast and your own website where you put together your thoughts. So why don't you tell us what that is, so if people want to find more of what your insights are on health and how what your recommendations are, how they can find that out.
I do have a website called foundmyfitness.com. That's all one word, Found My Fitness. And on my website, I make a variety of videos where I sort of break down, information in short little tidbits for people to understand. And I have a newsletter where I basically write long articles that are referenced. And I don't put any of my articles on my website yet. My newsletter, you can sign up for it on foundmyfitness.com. And I also have a podcast. So I have a variety.
And you interview experts just like I do.
I've been doing that recently. Yeah.
Which is very interesting. And so that's a really, you interview some because of your position in the academic community, you have access to some of these incredible researchers. So there's a lot of information that you're uncovering there, and do a great job at doing that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very exciting. I love talking to other scientists and extracting information and learning.
You've got that learning as one of your passions, clearly. So we all appreciate that, and look forward to future conversations in which we'll share some of that learning that you're uncovering.
Thank you, Dr. Mercola. I look forward to it. It's a pleasure having a discussion with you. Very, very much enjoy it.